In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood Estates, everything seemed pristine, perfectly manicured, and meticulously controlled. Rows of houses gleamed under the sun, lawns were trimmed to military precision, and flower beds looked like they had been curated for a magazine cover. But beneath the picture-perfect surface, an invisible war was quietly brewing. At the center of it was one woman, Karen Hargrove, known to the neighbors as the self-appointed HOA enforcer. Karen had moved into Maplewood Estates 5 years ago, carrying with her an unwavering belief in rules and a borderline pathological obsession with perfection. From day one, she immersed herself in the Homeowners Association, attending meetings religiously, scrutinizing every violation letter, and making it her personal mission to keep the neighborhood spotless. Her weapon of choice was the fine, a small but constant reminder that Maplewood Estates was not a place for sloppiness. A crooked fence? $50 fine. A faded welcome mat? $25 fine. A trash bin slightly visible from the curb? $75 fine. Her ledger of infractions was meticulously maintained, almost like a collector's album of grievances. Neighbors quickly learned that any deviation from Karen's stringent standards could result in a formal complaint. She had no tolerance for minor imperfections, and she wielded her authority like a sword. Children's toys left in driveways became points of contention, Halloween decorations were scrutinized for alignment and height, and even garden gnomes were suspect if they seemed out of place. At first, people laughed nervously at Karen's antics. It seemed almost comical that one person could care so much about a slightly crooked hedge. But as weeks turned into months, her influence grew, and her fines became more than just an annoyance. They became a source of tension and resentment. Every homeowner in Maplewood Estates felt her gaze, whether she was physically present or not. It was as though she had installed herself as the neighborhood's silent warden, watching from the shadows, waiting for the smallest mistake to pounce on. Her rise to notoriety reached its peak when she successfully convinced the HOA board to implement stricter landscaping guidelines. No plant could be taller than 3 feet without written approval. Grass had to be mowed every 7 days or risk a fine. Trash cans had to face inward toward the house, not the street. Karen's obsession with the rules became a neighborhood spectacle, and many residents quietly began to whisper about her, sharing stories of fines and ridiculous mandates over backyard fences. Yet despite the growing animosity, no one dared challenge her directly. Karen had mastered the art of intimidation without ever raising her voice. She was meticulous, organized, and, above all, persistent. Any attempt to argue or appeal a fine was met with a flurry of paperwork, HOA regulations, and references to bylaws that no ordinary homeowner could dispute. Her authority was airtight, her reputation untouchable, or so she believed. However, not everyone in Maplewood Estates was willing to bow to her tyranny. In the corner of the neighborhood lived the Simmons family, a young couple with 2 small children. They were new to the community and had yet to understand the unwritten rules of Karen's domain. Their front yard, though clean, had a slight slope in the grass and a few daffodils planted out of alignment. It wasn't anything extreme, but to Karen, it was an invitation. One crisp autumn morning, the Simmons family received their first notice, a fine for non-compliant landscaping. The amount was $50, a modest sum, but enough to send a chill down their spine. What shocked them wasn't the fine itself, but the sheer pettiness of it. They had barely unpacked, and already Karen had singled them out. Friends and neighbors offered advice in hushed tones. Pay the fine quietly, comply, and don't make waves. But the Simmons family wasn't used to being bullied, and deep down, they harbored a quiet spark of defiance. As the weeks went by, Karen's vigilance only intensified. Every little imperfection became a reason to issue another fine. A mailbox slightly tilted? Another $25. A leaf on the sidewalk? $10. The Simmons family kept a growing stack of notices, each one a testament to Karen's obsession. Friends began to joke that she was conducting some sort of personal crusade, a battle against disorder that existed only in her imagination. Karen's reign also had collateral effects on the rest of the neighborhood. Social gatherings became tense, casual conversations around fences turned into discussions about fines, and even the neighborhood dog walkers found themselves nervously adjusting their paths to avoid scrutiny. Maplewood Estates had become a community where fear of Karen outweighed simple neighborly connection. But unbeknownst to Karen, her strict enforcement and unchecked power were planting the seeds of rebellion. People were tired of tiptoeing around her. They were quietly observing, quietly planning, and quietly waiting for the perfect moment to turn the tables. Every petty fine, every complaint, every demand for absolute perfection created a subtle undercurrent of resentment that would soon boil over. The first cracks in Karen's armor appeared in the most unlikely way. A perfectly innocent neighborhood potluck. Families gathered under strings of lights, sharing casseroles and desserts, laughing about minor garden mishaps and sidewalk stains. Whispers began circulating about Karen's obsession with power. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances, and someone even joked about what would happen if the tables were turned. The idea, once unthinkable, planted itself in their minds. By the end of the evening, the mood had shifted. What had started as a pleasant gathering turned into a brainstorming session in disguise. Ideas for subtle payback, gentle sabotage, and calculated rebellion began to circulate. No one spoke of it aloud to Karen, of course. She was still feared, still commanding respect. But the sense of inevitability hung in the air. Her days of unchecked enforcement were numbered, and the seeds of retaliation had quietly been sown as Karen drove home that night. Satisfied with her latest batch of fines and the neighborhood's apparent compliance, she had no inkling that the winds of change were beginning to blow through Maplewood Estates. The perfection she demanded so desperately was starting to unravel. Not because anyone defied her directly, but because the collective frustration of the neighborhood had begun to coalesce into something larger, something strategic, something that would one day bring her carefully constructed empire crashing down. And so, as the streetlights flickered on and the first chill of evening settled over the lawns, a quiet tension hung in the air. Maplewood Estates remained pristine in appearance. Yet beneath the surface, a battle was quietly forming. Karen, the self-appointed queen of fines and enforcement, had no idea that the neighborhood she ruled with an iron fist was quietly preparing its first strike. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the war between petty power and collective revenge had only just begun. The weeks following the potluck brought a subtle shift to Maplewood Estates, a change almost imperceptible at first, but gradually swelling into something undeniable. The neighborhood, long dominated by Karen Hargrove's meticulous enforcement, began moving in unison, but quietly, cleverly, almost conspiratorially. It wasn't chaos yet. It was a slow, deliberate tightening of a plan designed to put the self-proclaimed HOA queen in her place. The Simmons family became the unofficial ringleaders of this quiet rebellion. It started small, an occasional misaligned garden gnome left deliberately askew, a subtle deviation in hedge trimming, but the gestures were calculated. Each act was minor enough to appear accidental, but when combined across multiple homes, they began forming a pattern. Karen, true to form, noticed every tiny infraction immediately. She logged each violation in her ledger, issuing notices and fines with ruthless efficiency. What she didn't realize was that these small acts were the first dominoes in a chain reaction that would soon engulf her entire domain. Other neighbors began to participate, often with barely perceptible acts of rebellion. Mailboxes were slightly tilted, fences had imperceptible chips or mismatched paint, and every once in a while, a small patch of weeds was left in a flower bed. Alone, these acts were trivial and easily punishable. But the sheer number of them, executed across dozens of homes, began to overwhelm Karen's obsessive record-keeping. Her inbox filled with complaints about the same trivial violations she had enforced so rigorously. It was as though the neighborhood itself was quietly conspiring against her. As Karen escalated her enforcement, the tension grew exponentially. Each new notice she sent out carried a faint scent of frustration, not just from the fines themselves, but from the effort required to monitor, record, and punish what she perceived as defiance. Her once pristine ledger began showing signs of cracks. Errors, overlapping fines, and notices mistakenly sent to the wrong homes. The first hint of chaos had begun to creep into her otherwise orderly world. The Simmons family knew that subtlety alone would not be enough. They began documenting Karen's obsessive behaviors, capturing photos of minor infractions and pairing them with the exorbitant fines she issued. They started compiling evidence of absurdity. A child's toy flagged as a permanent obstruction, a fence post slightly off-center, a trash can misaligned by a mere inch. Every photo, every document, became a tool in the larger plan. A silent archive of Karen's overreach that would later serve as ammunition for the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. She increased fines, tightened landscaping rules, and even began conducting surprise inspections of homes in the early morning hours. Her presence became oppressive, casting a shadow over even mundane tasks like taking out the trash or planting flowers. But the more she pushed, the more the neighborhood began to respond, not openly, but with a quiet, calculated resilience. Every new fine became a badge of resistance, every inspection a reminder of the simmering rebellion beneath the surface. The real turning point came with the holiday light incident, an event that would go down in Maplewood Estates history as the moment Karen's power began to unravel. One December evening, several families coordinated to hang lights in unconventional patterns. Garlands twisted creatively, icicle lights left intentionally uneven, and inflatable decorations strategically positioned just beyond HOA guidelines. Karen, armed with her clipboard and flashlight, inspected each home and began issuing fines at a furious pace. Yet her fury was met with amusement rather than fear. Families documented her inspections, posting anonymous photos and videos to a private online group. Her meticulous enforcement now had an audience, one that silently celebrated each ridiculous notice she sent. IT wasn't just about fines anymore. It was about optics, about reclaiming a sense of control over lives that had long been micromanaged. The neighborhood's rebellion had evolved from subtle sabotage into a full-scale psychological operation. Every resident understood the rules, but every resident now knew that Karen's strict adherence could be exploited. The more she tried to assert dominance, the more visible her obsession became, and the more the community found ways to turn her tyranny into amusement. The Simmons family escalated their plan further. They began coordinating small infractions in patterns designed to confuse and frustrate Karen. Trash bins would appear misaligned for mere hours, then move back into compliance just before inspections. Garden ornaments were rotated slightly overnight. Hedges were trimmed unevenly in one corner but perfectly in the other. Karen, in her unwavering pursuit of perfection, spent hours inspecting and documenting, unaware that her efforts were systematically orchestrated to overwhelm her sense of order. Tension in the neighborhood reached a tipping point when Karen attempted a neighborhood compliance audit. A day-long event in which she inspected every home, measuring hedges, counting weeds, and documenting minor deviations in meticulous detail. Residents, however, had prepared. Laughter and amusement were contained just enough to appear casual. Yet the prankish misalignments orchestrated by dozens of families made Karen's job nearly impossible. Each minor infraction she noted was countered by another slightly different one, creating a sense of chaos that she could neither control nor fully comprehend. By the end of the audit, Karen was exhausted. Her ledger, once a symbol of control and authority, had become a chaotic tangle of overlapping fines, repeated notices, and conflicting documentation. The very system she had created to maintain order was now working against her. For the first time, a sense of vulnerability crept into her meticulous world. Her obsession with perfection had blinded her to the collective power of the neighborhood, and the cracks in her armor were becoming increasingly evident. The stage was set for the final act. Karen, still unaware of the full extent of the organized rebellion, continued to enforce fines and demand compliance, oblivious to the fact that her authority was being systematically dismantled. The residents of Maplewood Estates, led by the Simmons family, had moved from quiet, subtle acts of defiance to a fully coordinated campaign designed to expose her obsession and reclaim control over their community. Every minor act of rebellion, every carefully documented absurdity, was a step toward the ultimate goal, a reckoning that would bring Karen face to face with the consequences of her tyranny. And so, as the sun set over Maplewood Estates, casting long shadows across the perfectly trimmed lawns, the neighborhood waited, poised at the edge of a new chapter. Karen Hargrove, once untouchable and omnipresent, remained unaware that the momentum of rebellion was growing unstoppable. What had begun as minor acts of defiance had now become a carefully orchestrated campaign, and the seeds of her downfall were already bearing fruit. The final confrontation, when it came, promised to be both dramatic and inevitable. The quiet rebellion had evolved into something unstoppable. The neighborhood had found its courage, its unity, and its strategy. And Karen, despite her meticulous records, her obsessive fines, and her iron-fisted authority, was about to discover that there are forces even stricter rules cannot contain. Winter in Maplewood Estates brought a crisp chill to the air, but the neighborhood was buzzing with a different kind of energy. The quiet rebellion that had simmered for weeks was now reaching its climax. Every household had played a part in the orchestrated campaign against Karen Hargrove, and the stage was set for the ultimate confrontation. This was not about petty grievances anymore. It was about collective justice, delivered with precision and flair. Karen, as usual, was oblivious to the scope of the plan. She continued her relentless inspections, carrying her clipboard like a badge of honor, determined to maintain her iron grip over Maplewood Estates. Her obsession had only intensified. She would wake early to check fences, patrol streets in the late afternoon, and double-check her ledger at night, ensuring no infraction went unnoticed. But her meticulous attention to detail had become her vulnerability. The neighborhood had learned her patterns, studied her routines, and now knew exactly when and how to execute the final phase of their plan. It began with subtle confusion. Overnight, trash cans were swapped between houses, hedges were trimmed in unexpected patterns, and garden ornaments mysteriously shifted positions. Karen woke to a world that seemed almost familiar, yet slightly askew. Every corner of Maplewood Estates appeared to comply with the rules on the surface, but small inconsistencies drove her into silent frustration. She could not pinpoint the source, and her obsessive mind began spiraling, trying to account for the impossibilities she observed. The Simmons family, acting as the operations coordinators, escalated their strategy. They had documented every petty fine Karen had issued over the past months, creating a meticulously organized archive. Each photo, each notice, each absurd rule was cataloged and ready to be presented, not as a complaint, but as undeniable evidence of Karen's extreme overreach. The neighborhood had united to collect this proof, ensuring that when the moment came, Karen would have no defense. That moment arrived on the day of the annual HOA review meeting, an event that Karen had anticipated as her opportunity to assert dominance one final time. She arrived early, clipboard in hand, prepared to lecture, fine, and enforce. What she did not expect was the coordinated spectacle waiting for her. Homes along the main street were deliberately decorated with minor, absurd infractions. Crooked flags, slightly tilted planters, and whimsical displays that flouted her strictest rules. The subtle chaos was enough to make Karen's eyes widen in disbelief. Inside the meeting hall, the Simmons family unveiled their masterstroke. A presentation of photos and notices appeared on a projector, detailing months of petty fines, arbitrary enforcement, and obsessive behaviors that bordered on the comical. Each slide highlighted Karen's meticulous notes alongside the triviality of the infractions she had targeted. A crooked flower, a misaligned mailbox, a single weed poking through the sidewalk. The audience, composed of every Maplewood Estates resident, watched in a mixture of amusement, disbelief, and vindication. Karen tried to defend herself, frantically flipping through her ledger, citing bylaws and regulations. But the evidence was overwhelming. The neighborhood had turned her own obsession against her, creating a record that exposed the absurdity of her behavior. For the first time, Karen faced a collective judgment she could not control or manipulate. The room, once silent in fear, now buzzed with quiet laughter and whispered validation. She was no longer the untouchable enforcer. She had become the subject of scrutiny. The turning point came when the HOA board, long complicit with Karen's actions, finally intervened. They reviewed the evidence, noting the excessive fines and petty complaints. It was clear that Karen had crossed a line from maintaining neighborhood standards into tyranny. The board voted to nullify all fines issued in the previous 6 months, effectively erasing the record of her reign. Karen, who had once held absolute power, now faced the reality that her authority had been dismantled by the very community she sought to control. Outside, the neighborhood celebrated in small, clever ways. Homeowners proudly displayed decorations that would have previously triggered fines, waving them like banners of rebellion. Laughter filled the streets where tension had once reigned. The Simmons family, quietly observing from their porch, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Their strategy of subtle, calculated resistance had succeeded, not with confrontation or anger, but with patience, unity, and ingenuity. Karen's response was muted. She retreated into her house, her clipboard abandoned on the kitchen counter, the meticulous records that had once symbolized power now a testament to her downfall. Her obsession, which had seemed invincible, had been systematically dismantled by a community unwilling to bow to fear. Maplewood Estates had reclaimed itself, not through chaos, but through coordinated, clever action. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Rules were still enforced, but the spirit of community had been restored. Residents no longer lived in fear of petty fines. They understood that order was best maintained with fairness and respect, not obsessive control. Karen, meanwhile, remained a figure of local legend, a cautionary tale of how unchecked power and obsessive behavior could be undone by clever resistance. The Simmons family, and the other residents who had participated, quietly celebrated their victory. They had not only reclaimed their neighborhood, but had sent a message that unity, strategy, and subtle rebellion could triumph over tyranny. Karen's reign of fines, once absolute, was now a story told in hushed tones and laughter. A reminder that obsession and pettiness could only last so long when faced with a collective will. As the sun set over Maplewood Estates, the lawns were still manicured, the sidewalks clean, and the homes orderly. But beneath the surface, a new energy hummed through the neighborhood, a sense of empowerment, resilience, and shared victory. Karen's obsessive enforcement had been dismantled, her control undone, and the community had emerged stronger and more united than ever. The petty fines that once caused tension had become the instrument of her undoing, and the lesson was clear. In the quiet suburbs of Maplewood Estates, unity and cleverness had triumphed over fear and tyranny, and so Karen Hargrove, once the untouchable HOA queen, had lost her battle. Not in a dramatic confrontation or scandalous blow-up, but in the slow, clever, and unstoppable march of a neighborhood refusing to live under fear. Maplewood Estates had won back its streets, its homes, and its peace, proving that even the most obsessive reigns of control can be undone when a community acts together with patience, strategy, and quiet determination.